Hi, Matt. Welcome. Welcome to AVENUE.B podcast, where we explore strategy, design, and brand consumer relationships by understanding people emotionally, socially, and cognitively, especially cognitively today. Today, I'm here with Matt Johnson, professor at Harvard University's Division of Continuing Education, specializing in consumer psychology, neuroscience, and marketing. He is author of Blindsight and Branding That Means Business. And after earning his PhD in cognitive psychology from Princeton, his work has probed the science of brand storytelling, experiential marketing, and consumer decision making. Hi, Matt. Well, lovely to have you here. Today, we'll dive into more the cognition piece of brands. So, going into what we see, what we believe, how we act, and what we feel. So, perception, meaning, decision making, and emotion. How do we perceive? How do we believe and make meaning of our world? What do we desire, and how do we achieve that future version of ourselves? And what emotions do we feel that are impacting those decisions and actions towards that? So, Matt, you talk a lot about mental models when you talk about perception. And people say that your brand can tell the difference between imagination and reality. So, how would you describe mental models, and how do brands use those to make us see or perceive a different reality that could bias us towards brands?
Yeah, so something that we've known for many years now, many decades in the field of perceptual psychology and perceptual neuroscience is that we really don't take in the world objectively. We don't have this kind of faithful replay from visual information, auditory information, haptic sensations in the skin, and then have that relayed into the brain to interpret reality. It's really just not how it works. What we ultimately perceive is not the world as it is, but it's our brain's mental model. So our brain really builds an estimation of what it thinks its kind of best guess of what the world is like in any given moment. So, when you're eating chocolate cake, for example, you're not actually eating the chocolate cake. It's a little bit trippy to think about, but you're not really actually tasting the chocolate cake. You're tasting your brain's estimation of the chocolate cake, of what that specific bite tastes like. And so, our ultimate perception, whether it's visual, it's gustatory, it's in other domains, is this model, it's this estimation. And this model is extremely impressionable. There's many, many things that influence it beyond just this sensory input. So going back to the chocolate cake example, the same exact chocolate cake would very likely taste very, very different to you if you're eating it in a fancy 4.5 star Michelin restaurant, right? You have this model of what this cake should taste like, giving this setting and giving all these beliefs that we have about it. But if somebody were to come in and tell you before that third bite, oh, by the way, sorry, we dropped the cake on the ground and somebody stepped on it, and that would influence the next perception you'd have of that taste of cake, right? So the cake hasn't changed. What's changed is our beliefs about it, and these beliefs can influence our mental models. And so we can see this a lot in the consumer world when it comes to kind of gustatory brands, F&B. There's been literally hundreds of experiments done in the wine industry, for example. So for whatever reason, consumer psychologists love studying wine, and there's hundreds of experiments attesting to the fact that the same exact bottle of wine poured into the same glass can taste very, very differently if one you're led to believe it's expensive when it isn't. You're led to
Yeah.
believe that it comes from a specific part of the world that has a strong reputation for wine. If it's poured to you from a glass that has more syllables on the label, if it's poured in a crystal chalice as opposed to a styrofoam cup, all these things make the wine taste better, and none of them have anything to do with the actual wine itself. And so when you get to the level of the brand, there's a ton of brand related effects for this as well. Because what is the brand? It's really the totality of our emotional and semantic associations. It forms the beliefs we have about what it is we're experiencing. So there's a great study done with Ray-Bans where they gave people identical sunglasses. One group, they were just led to believe that they were Ray-Ban sunglasses, and people reported that it blocked the sun better. There's been some experiments, similar experiments with Nike. So I've done some work with Nike, effectively, swap sunglasses in for golf clubs. You get a very similar effect. So people are hitting golf balls from the same golf clubs. One group is just led to believe that they are Nike golf clubs. There's a little Nike logo that's put on there, and they hit the ball about 15% farther. Right. So none of this has to do with the actual physical product, and has everything to do with the brand and the beliefs it instills in the consumer. So yeah, our world is effectively a mental model, our brain's estimation of it, and brands can play in this space by really bridging this gap between objective reality and our subjective experience.
Okay, wow. So there's almost no universal truth to anything. It's just an interaction between people and brands, where we are estimating our own version of reality, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can get very like mind melty about it. I mean, I do think there
Yeah.
is an objective physical reality that's external to us, but the way we perceive it, the way that we interpret it, isn't straightforward. There isn't a universally accepted, straightforward, objectively correct interpretation. And so, given this inherent ambiguity, brands, especially brands that we trust, can play a very strong role in shaping those interpretations and in shaping them in ways that the brand desires in terms of how it wants us to interpret these signals.
So would you say that brands are the ones that create this version of reality that they hope that consumers are now perceiving, or are they adjusting towards what customers already believe and perceive, like chicken or the egg, who comes first, basically?
Yeah, it goes both ways. It's a great question, but it gets into this whole dynamic of market orientation. So we see some very, very strong brands really shape fundamentally how consumers or the market in general feels and attaches to certain types of products, right? So one example that comes to mind is De Beers and diamonds, right? So you think about diamonds, what's the intrinsic value of a diamond? It's just a rock, right? It's just a stone, right? Is there really any difference between a diamond or an emerald or a ruby? Not really. This big Belgian company basically created a monopoly and controls, supply, and so creates a lot of artificial scarcity. And then via decades of very powerful branding and marketing, have basically instantiated into the mind of the market, the global market, that this is a very valuable gem and it's associated with love and engagement and this whole idea that you're supposed to spend, what is it, 2 months of your salary on your diamond. I mean, that's totally invented by the brand, right? So you have an otherwise arbitrary piece of earth, and there's nothing inevitable about diamonds becoming this symbol of love and endurance and perfection, but for the marketing and the brand work of a diamond company. So I think they're a great example of a very market driving force, right? They tell consumers, they tell the market how to feel about this product. But then you have, on the other end of that spectrum, you have very market driven brands, right? Who says, I don't know what's cool, I don't know what's interesting, I don't know what's valuable. I want my consumers to tell me what they want, and then I'll deliver it back to them. So you look at, ultra fast fashion brands like an ASOS or a Nasty Gal or a Boohoo or a Shein. They don't have like creative conviction about what fashion should be or what a dress should look like or what a blouse should look like. They basically put a bunch of social media advertisements in front of consumers. They see what is expressed in terms of stated preferences, and then they just deliver that to consumers. They deliver it to them with an incredibly efficient infrastructure. So this whole kind of project of meaning making and shaping perception, it can come directly from the brand, but then it can also come from the market itself.
Okay. Okay, great. So, our reality seems to be heavily influenced by our own history and values and experiences, and also short term memory, apparently, which leads to our form of perception at a given moment. So, from what we perceive and see, how do we start to create meaning of something and our idea and self-concept of our own identity from that. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
I mean, I think it's a two-way street. I think our beliefs and our ideas, our history, our memories, these form these schema, right? So when we're talking about this modeling process, what we're really talking about are schema, this kind of category of our semantic knowledge that provides these predictions for how our world should be and how our reality should be. But those schema are also heavily influenced by our social group and our culture and how we came up and what our social group values, right? So as we are talking about before, there isn't really a universally accepted, objectively correct interpretation of reality at any given moment. And so to interpret this, inherent ambiguity, we look to our social group, right? So you look at something like, there's a great example that Marcus Collins gave. You look at like a cow, for example, right? To some people, a cow is dinner. To other people, a cow is leather. To other people, a cow is a deity, right? And so, it is all of those things and none of those things. And our interpretation is going to be largely contingent upon our social group, the culture that we came up with, the beliefs that we've adopted, which inform our schema. And there can be different subgroups and subcultures that form. Of course, we can rebel against these kind of socially accepted ways of seeing the world and try and become our own independent, deity, or not deity, but our own independent entity. But there's a lot of interesting research. So I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but there's all sorts of interesting research now on this idea of like individual authenticity, right? And we think that we want to get outside of all this social influence and find our own individual idiosyncratic way of seeing the world. But it turns out when we leave our social group, like we don't get more wise, we don't get more objective, we just get a bit deranged, we get a bit lonely. And in fact, studies indicate that we actually feel most authentic and we feel most true to who we really, really are, truest self, when we're amidst our social group and when we're acting in accordance with social norms. And so, yeah, I don't think there really is a clear divide between individual perception and kind of this group level social perception.
Okay. And you talked in our course on neuroscience. We talked about designing meaning and how you can design almost the feeling of serendipity, of something that is almost meant to be. So what's kind of the formula for brands to create serendipity, and what does that do in the brain for a consumer?
Yeah, so I love this question. So it's really predicated on this observation that we as human beings, we're these meaning-seeking creatures. The brain fundamentally is a meaning-seeking organ. We don't just take the world in passively. We're always kind of looking for patterns amidst this incoming stream of data, and we're looking for patterns in events that are happening to us and with our understanding of our personal histories. So we're always kind of looking for that greater sense of meaning. I mean, you can go back to Albert Camus, that we kind of call out to life for meaning, and life can't respond with a firm answer. So what do we do with that? The gap becomes eloquent, right? And so there's this gap where meaning can kind of fill in endogenously. And so it gets really interesting in the consumer world because there's evidence suggesting that when we have certain types of experiences, specifically consumer experiences where there's no clear explanation as to why we should be having that experience, we can kind of fill those experiences in, given this pattern detecting orientation that we have, to be deeply meaningful on a personal level. And so there's research indicating that we tend to enjoy experiences that are, one, positive, so they're positively valence, but we enjoy them more when they have a surprise element. So surprise kind of makes a good experience great. And then we add in this final element where the experience is also inexplicable. There's no clear explanation or clear understanding as to why we should be having it. That's kind of this formula for serendipity. So things that are enjoyable, surprising, and inexplicable. There's a great series of studies by Akyung Kim at a University of Sydney where effectively they teased this out, and what they did is they gave people pieces of chocolate, right? So straight off the bat, that's enjoyable, and they either gave this to them in a candy store, where we might expect this, or in the lobby of a bank, where we probably would not expect this. And then the final condition, they either gave them an explanation as to why they were having this chocolate experience, or no explanation at all. They kind of just walked away after they gave it to them. And across all of these different combinations, the best result was chocolate in the lobby of the bank with no explanation. So enjoyable, surprising, and inexplicable. And it's this combination of factors that's associated with the highest amount of feelings of kind of serendipity and meaning associated with consumer experiences.
And the candy, like the positive association was with the candy, not the context. So not the bank or candy store. It was with the
Exactly.
chocolate.
Yeah, people ascribed meaning to the product specifically. There was something deeply meaningful and this feeling of kind of serendipity about the chocolate itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So brands can create deeper meaning for the customer by orchestrating or designing these moments that feel like they're meant to be, with the formula enjoyment, surprise, plus inexplicability, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's
Okay.
definitely harder than maybe it sounds, right? Especially this final part of inexplicability, because you want to provide an experience that the consumer is going to enjoy, they're going to be surprised by it, but even in the consumer's mind, there's no kind of clear understanding. And us in marketing, right? We want to tell the consumer what we did. If we, had our entire marketing team stay up overnight designing this product experience, we want to tell the consumer about it. But this is actually an area where we want to show a bit of restraint and just let the consumer bask in a bit of mystery, because it's that gap in understanding which is kind of the fertile ground for these feelings of serendipity and meaning to unfold. That if you have a marketer, you have somebody come up to you and say, "Hey, this is meaningful, 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 meaningful. Be interested in this. Look how cool this is." Like, we're probably not going to respond to it, right? We're
No.
this is reactance theory, where we tend to rebel initially against new forms of social influence. We kind of need the consumer to fill it in for themselves. We want to leave that blank open for these feelings of meaning and serendipity to fill in.
And I'm sure brands can kind of play around with that, right? Like if they understand the consumer's individual and subjective expectation and can design a completely different context around that. Um, Sometimes in the chocolate example, you don't even need to know the consumer. You know that in a bank, you probably, based on the other realities people have had, they won't necessarily receive chocolate. So I feel like there's a lot of design or experience design that is kind of open towards different brands. So from what I understand, the difference between meaning, belief, and identity so far is that meaning or creating meaning and patterns is almost a survival tool, since we interpret our environment and try to reduce uncertainty. Our beliefs are a emotional prediction that is stored in our memory of what we expect, what we trust, what we value so far based on our social circle as well. And our identity is our self-concept that is almost a social anchor, and mirrors a narrative consistency over time.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think we are these meaning seeking creatures, and we have to have, or we're motivated to have, kind of an overarching model of how the world works and how other people work. We're kind of motivated to reduce. It's called reducing prediction error. So we have this model that creates predictions for how the world is going to be and how people are going to act. And when people don't act, or the world doesn't act how we expect it to, that creates prediction error. And that is kind of the discrepancy between our expectation and the outcome. And so how we learn through time, and how we try to navigate the world, is to reduce prediction error. So we're trying to navigate the world in a way where we not root out surprise, because there's definitely positive forms of surprise, but we don't want to be surprised in a way that is going to impact us negatively. So we want to feel confident in our model, and confident in our model means having the least amount of prediction error possible.
Okay. So moving from how we see the world and how we believe in the world and create meaning of it, we now have a self-concept and an identity of ourselves in the world, but we don't always act like it. So moving on to desire, discipline, and the future self, or the decision making and acting part. Some research says that that different factors like the time of day, if it's late at night and you're tired or depleted, or have different environmental cues or habits, or are stressed, that can really bias you towards one or the other, either impulsively reacting or rationally acting towards the future self that you're actually trying to become. So let's say if you want to be on a diet and your best behavior and don't eat any sugar, and you go and see a donut shop at 6 p.m. after work and you're tired, you're more likely to probably go into that shop and have a donut, even though it doesn't really resonate with the future self you want to be. And in brand relationships, a lot of brands do this immediate gratification that is almost unsustainable to outpace, because you have to, because the dopamine baseline recalibrates, right? And then either you're subjectively better than what you delivered, or you are having this prediction error you just talked about. So what does this mean for brands? My question is, in order to motivate and retain customers, do brands need to create this immediate anticipation of pleasure and also create a cognitive lifestyle where people are more satisfied with who they are becoming? Is that a balance that they need to create because it makes sense to who they believe they are? What do you think about that?
It's a great question. I think there's probably not going to be a one size fits all approach here. I mean, immediately gratifying pleasure can be a powerful force in the consumer world, and we do see entire industries in which brands within an industry are trying to compete for exactly that. I mean, we see it to a certain extent. We already talked about fast fashion. You could kind of expand Temu into that as well, where it's, not really trying to build long-term, meaningful, brand-based aesthetic relationships with consumers, but trying to appeal to impulse to a certain extent, and trying to scratch an itch and then make that itch scratchy all over again. And that's kind of the relationship they're trying to develop with their customers. So you have that approach, but you also have another approach where, sure, there's pleasure to a certain extent, and you're delivering positively valenced experiences, but not pleasure in kind of a generic sense. You're delivering pleasure or meaning or positively valenced experiences through the lens of a specific brand, right? There's a specific feeling of belonging that you're trying to provide, or a specific feeling of meaning, and you're trying to develop, tap into a certain social identity that the consumer has, or the consumer sees their aspirational self through you. And so pleasure can be part of that conversation, but it's coming through the brand lens. If you look at a brand like Lululemon or Nike or Bang& Olufsen, right? These are brands that, deliver positive experiences, and sure, pleasurable experiences. And sometimes there's a bit of immediate gratification there, and there's a role for that, but it's done through the lens of a very well thought out, long-term oriented brand, which also taps into elements of our social identity. So the way I've come to see it is that, if we're trying to appeal to impulse, we're trying to appeal to immediate gratification, it's mostly a product value story, right? So nobody goes to Temu because they love the Temu brand. They go to it because it delivers on this kind of
Utility, yeah.
utility, right? Or
Yeah.
an Amazon is the same way. It's a marketplace, right? So you go there for, the raw utility or the raw sense of value or pleasure you can get to it. But there's nothing at a brand level, at a meaning level that draws you to it. So, but if you're going for something broader and you're trying to build equity with consumers, you're trying to build long-term relationships, the product very, very, very important, especially distinctive products, proprietary products. But you're tapping into this bigger sphere of meaning, the totality of our semantic and emotional associations that we call the brand. So it's mostly, in that instance, a brand conversation.
You recently also published an article on this called "Is Your Future Self Real? Empathy with the Future to Make Better Decisions in the Present." So, how do you view the future self, or as you called it, the aspirational self? Is it, or how do consumers and the brain view it? Is it a separate person? How do we empathize with it towards, or how do we even form our goals and then work towards that vision of our conscious aspirational self?
Love this topic. So this is a big area of research, and really I should say that the person behind a lot of these ideas and a lot of the research, his name is Hal Hirschfield at UCLA. He wrote a great book. I think it's called Future You. And I think, frankly, it's a bit of a trip to think about because we're future-oriented creatures, right? Decisions that we make now necessarily impact not our present self, but our future self, right? So simple decisions, should I save, put $100 in my 401k, or should I spend that $100 on Timu, for example, right? That's a question where we're kind of making a decision to kind of, provide immediate pleasure to my present self or my near-term future self, or am I kind of giving a gift to this future self who I'll never meet, right? You're a different person to a certain extent at age 65 once you're finally cashing out your 401k than you are at age 40, right? And so there is this kind of interesting divide, and I think for me at least gets very philosophical. Like, are we the same enduring entity kind of moving through time, and we can feel a deep sense of empathy and connection with our 5-year-old self and 15 and 25 and 40, and we can potentially feel that into the future? Or are we kind of these like distinct categories that we were a totally different person in this previous era, right? And so I don't think there's any one good way to think about it, but I think from a business perspective, especially if the brand has long-term ambitions, I think it is very important to get the consumer to a certain extent into kind of a long-term mode of thinking. I think the brand, by definition, is about the future self, right? And so this is something that big kind of world-beating brands, I think, have tapped into, converged on to a certain extent, where a brand like Nike or Apple, right, it's not just about, technology, but it's about, being a better version of yourself through the lens of the brand. Like, you're being more creative and more divergent and more interesting through Apple. You're going to be more, you're going to accomplish your dreams. You're going to be more ambitious through Nike, for example, right? And these are very long-term conversations. I think brands, kind of tying back to what we talked about previously, that are about immediate gratification, immediate pleasure, they kind of stay in the realm of product, right? They're not really into the realm of bigger picture, future you conversations and building an empathy with this potential future self. So yeah, it's a fascinating conversation, but I do think that brands, especially those with kind of these longer term ambitions, do need to kind of tap into this future oriented thinking.
There are also some psychology terms I wrote down also from your course. So temporal discounting, that we value now more than we value later, probably because we never experience ourselves in the future, or all we ever have is now. And maybe it's how important is it for you in this moment that your future self is who you want to be. And I'm not even sure if it's more valuable to talk about the consumer perspective or the brand perspective, because it is more of an individual goal setting or behavioral stability that you're designing for yourself. So for the individual, how How would you explain things like this temporal discounting or pleasure habituation or effective forecasting?
Yeah, I think you've explained it pretty well. Yeah, temporal discounting is this observation from behavioral economics that the same amount of money in the present means something different to us, and we're motivated to obtain it differently at different times in the future. So if somebody says, "Hey, do you want $10 right now or $10 in the future?" We're going to take the $10 right now. But if they say, "Hey, do you want $10 right now or $12 in the future?" Then it kind of depends, and maybe you do want to stave off your immediate impulse and take the $10 because you're forfeiting that for a greater reward later on, right? And there's no right way to go about it, but there's trade-offs either way. And going back to our previous conversation about 401ks, right? That's kind of the temporal discounting on a massive scale. Like, do you want $100 now, or do you want probably going to be $700, later on if you're accruing all that interest and it's, going up in value. But you're going to get it, 25 years later. So, we're faced with these things all the time. There's a ton of research on kind of individual differences between these things. People that are more impulsive tend to discount much more. So if you say, "Hey, do you want $12 in 2 weeks, $10 right now?" Yeah, that $12 feels like $6, feels like $4 if you have to wait 2 weeks to get it. So, yeah, I think, there's no right way to go about it, but consumers really differ quite significantly in how they make these judgments, for sure.
Okay. So almost in order to fulfill these goals in the future, we have to empathize with a version of ourselves that we are never meeting and have to make sacrifices now to
Yeah,
achieve
I think
that.
that's one way to think about it. I mean, Hal Hershfield's done some really interesting work where the more you can like viscerally and visually connect with your future self and imagine this future self as a real red-blooded, three-dimensional human being that you will, sooner or later be, can actually make you in the present more likely to make good decisions for that future self. So we've done some experiments with, I don't know if you remember this app from a few years ago called Face App, where, I mean, there's a bunch of, different models now, but basically you take a picture of yourself and it'll just like artificially age you however long.
Yeah.
It can be a bit scary to do. But it'll basically like, have you ever wondered what you look like at age 65? This app will tell you basically. And if you do Face App and you do it regularly and you kind of you can build a visual visceral connection with this future self. And studies have indicated, and this is Hal Hershfield's work, that if you're doing this and you're imagining this you at age 65 and you can see yourself, you can imagine what your priorities are, you can do some a bit of storytelling and imagine your house and you're going to have grandkids, et cetera, then you actually make decisions which are more empathetic towards this future self, and you're more likely to make sacrifices in the current moment to benefit this future self.
Also, if anyone wants to read your article on LinkedIn, there was a direct quote by Hirschfield that you included. It may not be problematic to think about our future selves as if they were other people, as long as we see them as people with whom we have a close, emotionally bonded relationship. For those are the sorts of relationships that inspire us to make sacrifices.
Yeah, I
It's
like that.
very, very powerful. So connecting with the future while in the now is key there, and I think this also goes into almost vision boarding, or creating a vision board with visualizations from your first perspective. So not like a picture of a car, but a picture of you, your hand on the driving wheel, or making it more visual to what it actually will look like as your future self or as your aspirational self. So
Totally.
now we understand how we see, believe, and act in the world on our way towards our aspirational self. Let's go into the emotions and how we feel. So what emotions are relevant in decision making and consumer behavior, and how do these emotions decide what is relevant, what is positive, what is worth pursuing and buying, how do emotions and the brain lead to this?
Yeah, I mean, emotion is a massive, massive topic. I feel like we could probably spend like an hour just talking about emotion. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, I think the way that we've typically come to think about them in neuroscience is two different kind of schools of thought. One is that, it's more descriptive in nature, that, we shouldn't think about emotions as these kind of discrete labels that have been kind of passed on through different languages, but we should think about kind of dimensions of emotion, that there's um, certain kind of priorities that we have, and certain levels and kind of tiers of experience that are important to human beings, and different emotions are kind of combinations of those feelings, right? So this is done some there's been some great work done about this at MIT, where you have these kind of three dimensions of emotion. You have arousal, which is basically how primed you are for action in a given moment. There's valence, which is kind of how much you would want to repeat that experience again, how good it feels, versus how much you would never want to have that experience again. And then you have motivation, which is kind of, if you understand the source of this emotion, would you want to approach it, or do you want to retreat from it? And essentially, these are all independent dimensions of emotion, and something like anger or jealousy or hatred or loneliness, we can think about all of these as kind of a location in this three-dimensional space. So this is kind of the descriptive way to think about it. There's also another way to think about it in terms of what we spoke about earlier, which is predictive processing theory and this kind of model. So according to this idea, what we feel internally is prediction error, effectively. That we have a model of how our body should feel if we're kind of in line with long-term health and structural integrity and long-term well-being. And when we have our body is constantly, and our emotional system is constantly kind of creating predictions for how we should feel in a given scenario, and then how you should feel, which is in line with your long-term health, is different from the way you actually feel, then we have prediction error, and the prediction error is experienced as an emotion, right? So you can think about something like stress, right? So this is kind of a spike or fluctuation of our autonomic nervous system, our stress response. And so your body, in most scenarios, expects you to have a heart rate in this range, and a breathing rate in this range, and blood pressure in this range. And if you find yourself in a scenario where you feel something very different, you can feel your heart racing, you can feel your blood pumping, then you experience that in terms of the emotion as stress, right? It feels stressful, right? And that kind of additional feeling beyond this physiological response, gives you a sense of urgency to kind of navigate the situation. But what we feel in terms of the interiority of it comes from prediction error between how we should feel in this scenario and our body's actual reaction. And one last thing to add on to that is this is very context specific. And so if you're in a room full of people and it's 75 degrees and everything's totally fine, and you start feeling your heart racing and your palms sweating and your capillaries dilating and you're breathing really fast, then that's going to stress you out. It's like, oh my God, why am I so nervous? Something must be wrong. And that's going to create an anxiety response. But if you have that same exact physiological response, but you're in a gym and you're working out and you're running really fast and your heart's pumping and your capillaries are dilating, your palms are sweating, that's fine, because that's what we expect given the context, right? So emotion is very context-based, and these prediction errors, what would determine something as a prediction error or not, also very context-dependent.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I only knew that they're like these prediction errors, that if it's somewhat negative to what you subjectively think, that it's like a huge, like even if it's only 5% less good, it's like a huge impact on how you think about a brand or how you think about that experience, I think. But I've never thought about the subsequent emotion that comes from that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's one school of thought, and I do think it's a very compelling way to think about it. The research kind of behind a lot of these ideas, her name is Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's done some great work called interoceptive theory. And, one very compelling example that she gives, which I think is very persuasive, is like imagine yourself in a scenario where you're going back to the gym example, you're really, you're working out, you're really parched, and you finally get actually have some water here. You finally get to some water, and you finally get to take that first sip of water. Like your whole body, your whole everything feels better before the water has even touched your tongue, right? Just getting to the water, you already feel better. And how can that be? Because the water hasn't had a chance to have any impact on your physiology. Is because the way we feel is not how our actual bottom up physiology. It's how we predict we're going to feel, right? So if we know we're going to be able to be quenched in zero point 0.2 milliseconds because we've got this water in our hand, we already feel better, right? So we're constant kind of living how what we predict is what we feel to a very large extent.
Okay, so it's almost having like if you know that you have a supply to your need, even without tapping into that supply, you already reap the benefits of it. Or
Yeah,
your brain thinks it does.
definitely, definitely. I
Okay.
mean, you can imagine, being in the same kind of scenario, but, in one case, there's a variable there that keeps you safe. So if you're, I don't know, skydiving or something, and you're like, oh my God, I'm so high up, but then, you look down and you've got your parachute, and it's like, okay, I'm gonna be okay, right? So, it's kind of like that. It's like, you're judging, or you're unconsciously judging your safety and your sense of danger by virtue of all this kind of context dependency.
Okay. Another little trade-off almost that you talk about is novelty versus familiarity. So having or as a brand, creating novelty and excitement via adrenaline or dopamine has to be in some sort of happy balance between that and also familiarity, trust, and safety, oxytocin based, value based communities. How do both of these emotions, I don't know if those are emotions, but emotions affect the consumer, and how do brands create this balance so they don't uh, that it doesn't tip over into one of the other?
Yeah, so this is where we come to kind of the very contradictory nature of human beings, right? With these kind of very strange, contradictory, paradoxical creatures. And one area of paradox is kind of our orientation towards novelty. So on the one hand, we are neophobic, right? We don't like novelty. New things, that's the unknown. The unknown can potentially hurt us. We'd rather not. But on the other hand, we are neophiliacs. We like what's new. It's kind of interesting and mysterious and enthralling. So how can we kind of reconcile that? Well, there's been some work in, especially in design theory, around this idea of a happy medium between the two. That yeah, sometimes we like things that are new, sometimes we like things that are familiar, make us feel safe, but we're really maximally oriented to things which integrate artfully what's new and what's safe. So this is specifically the work of Raymond Loewy, who said that to sell anything new, make it feel familiar. To sell anything familiar, you want to make it feel new. So we had this kind of theory called most advanced yet acceptable, right? That we are always, as human beings, wanting interesting, new, enthralling things, but we also kind of want to feel a bit safe. Too new and it's kind of threatening or weird and we don't get it. Too familiar and we're bored to death, right? We really want that happy medium and really providing experiences which feel safe but also provide something a bit new. That's really where the sweet spot is. You can see it in music where you have kind of new songs coming out, but they're like renditions of old songs or they're spins on old songs, right? You never hear a song that's like totally and completely new that people end up, there's all sorts of weird experimental stuff happening, of course, but songs that tend to gain in popularity tend to be kind of iterations on existing things that people are already familiar with. So culture doesn't, or culture in terms of creative output tends not to move like in big stepwise functions, but pretty gradually through this kind of slow evolution where you're couching new things in what's already familiar.
Okay, so it sounds like brands have to balance novelty and a feeling of emotional safety for the consumer and use new things to excite and familiarity to build trust, and then having that happy medium
Yep.
to create comfort or surprising comfort basically, or maintain a long-term engagement with the brand.
Yeah, I like that. I like that framing, like surprising comfort, right? So I think we see it a lot in technology brands where it is a really cool piece of technology and it can allow the consumer to do things differently and see things differently and act differently. But it's like it's too much differently all at once, right? So we saw this back in, what was it, 2010 with Google Glass. Google Glass was a great product, right? It had great specs at the time. It let it do really, really cool things, but it was like too new. There was like too much. It was like asking the consumer to like exist 15 years, 20 years into the future. It was like just too
Yeah,
new, right? And so it wasn't a problem with
true.
the product, but really how it was framed for the consumer. You had all that novelty, not the kind of comfort and familiarity.
Yeah, that's a great example. So, as a kind of last closing reflection after going through how we see, how we believe, how we act, and how we feel, so for brands to sustain this long-term engagement and emotional resonance, what kind of one mindset shift for both the customer to become their higher self, and also to for the brand to help them cognitively get there? What kind of mindset shift would you suggest to create this emotional resonance?
Yes, I mean, it may sound very trite, but I think it would really be trust, right? That trust changes everything. That when a consumer trusts a brand, they really stop seeing the brand's claims through a very critical lens, and they start to kind of invite the brand in a bit more. So I think trust is the ultimate outcome, the ultimate goal that you're going for. How to get there, obviously, is much more difficult. I think if you asked any brand if they could kind of crank the dial in one dimension, they'd be like, yeah, I would definitely want my consumers to trust me more. How do you get there? It's a little bit less straightforward, but there's a lot of interesting research in social psychology, and especially applying social psychology to brands, which indicates that the brands that we tend to trust the most and we tend to develop these long-term relationships with are those that we personify in a very specific way. So, as human beings, we don't just personify people, we don't just personify humans. We personify all sorts of things. People name their car, people talk to ChatGPT and give ChatGPT names, right? We personify all these inanimate things, and this is no less true for brands. So you see, Nike as being world beating and ambitious. You think Apple and it's smart and it's minimalist. You think of, Ford Motor Company and it's gruff, right? It has human personality characteristics. And when those human personality characteristics come through a specific lens, which is that they're perceived to be very warm and very competent, that's when trust seems to unfold. So some great work by Susan Fisk, who was a professor of mine in graduate school, that really showed that if we score highly on dimensions of warmth, having good intentions, competence, can you act on these intentions? That basically does the lion's share of the work in terms of being liked and being trusted, right? Something like 85% of the overall variance towards whether you like somebody or you trust somebody can be explained if you know how they feel about them in terms of their warmth, which is again good intentions, and competence. Can they act on these good intentions? And so I think brands that are really wanting to earn trust, which I think is kind of the ultimate dial that brands really want to crank, should do everything they're doing from their unique brand personality, but in a way that exudes good intentions, right? Where they can really feel that warmth.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt. Really, reading your articles or taking one of your courses or just talking to you is always so insightful on both individual goal perspective and brand perspective. And I really think that today we created a holistic model to forming brand consumer relationships that really help consumers get to where they want to be in life as identity shift, but also for brands to facilitate that journey. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you.
Absolutely. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.